Welcome back, everyone. Now I'm going to go into a much more detailed description of the process of speciation and species selection. And this is from one of my favorite papers in the last few years of science. It's a paper from Goldberg et al. That I will tell you a lot about. So first of all, I know that plants can't talk. And even if plants could talk, I don't think that they would insult one another using curse phrases. But if we imagine a world where plants can talk and they're not very nice, one of the things that plants might say to one another is to go fertilize yourself. So this is the paper that I'm going to talk about to you in a little bit of detail today. This is from Emma Goldberg and colleagues. It was published in Science in 2010. And the title of the paper is Species Selection Maintains Self-Incompatibility. So this is a good example of a modern macroevolutionary paper about the process of species selection. The topic that Goldberg et al. Studied in this paper is the evolution of self-compatibility and incompatibility in hermaphroditic plants. So many plants, including this bittersweet nightshade, so this plant on the left is a member of the nightshade group of plants, are hermaphrodites with both male and female parts on a single plant. And here in this nightshade, in this bittersweet nightshade, you have male and female parts on a single flower. In turn, many species that have these hermaphroditic properties have evolved self-incompatibility. And self-incompatibility is the ability of individual plants to recognize and reject their own pollen, basically to prevent them from mating with themselves. If we contrast self-incompatibility, which is what I just described, you recognize your own pollen when it lands on you and you don't use it to make offspring, versus self-compatibility, so that's individuals being able to reproduce with themselves, we can see some advantages and disadvantages of each. So if we just look through this little chart right here, you have self-incompatibility over here and self-compatibility. If you're self-compatible, you get to pass on your genes really well. So 100% of your genetic material goes to each of your offspring. If you're self-incompatible, then half the genetic material is coming from your mate, and so you only pass on half of your genes. Advantage, self-compatibility. Another advantage of self-compatibility comes when you become really rare. And so plants can become pollen limited. So if you imagine a plant growing in the forest and no other plants of the same species are anywhere near it, it might never get any pollen from outside. And so only if you're self-compatible can you reproduce in that situation. Advantage, self-compatibility. The big advantage to self-incompatibility, though, is that you can avoid inbreeding. So if you breed with yourself, that's really strong inbreeding, even stronger than, for example, if a human were to breed with a brother or sister. This is one level more extreme than that. So any rare recessive disease that you have will have a really high chance of being transmitted to your offspring if you're self-compatible and if you're fertilizing yourself. So self-incompatibility has this big advantage of avoiding inbreeding, but we have to pay the costs of passing on genes and reproducing when rare. So this is the kind of balance that Goldberg et al. Wanted to study. And in groups like the nightshades, you have, over the course of the entire clade, some species are self-incompatible and some species are self-compatible. And so Goldberg et al. Wanted to know if they could figure out how you can balance these trade-offs between these two different types of traits. It also makes sense that self-incompatibility and compatibility might influence rates of speciation and or extinction. If they have to do with inbreeding, inbreeding can cause a population to cascade out into extinction. These are things that involve the ability of plants to mate with one another, and remember, reproductive isolation is a key to speciation. So it makes sense that self-compatibility and incompatibility might somehow feed back on these macroevolutionary rates of speciation and extinction. So what did Goldberg et al. Do to study this? Well, they gathered a big data set. So this is a phylogenetic tree of nightshades. You can see the big clades labeled on the outside. And then these little circles all the way around the outside represent the two traits. So the blue circles are self-compatible species. The purple circles represent self-incompatible species. They then built a model. So in their model, they had the two traits, self-compatible and self-incompatible. And in their model, species can transition between those two traits with some probability. So species might become self-incompatible from self-compatible or vice versa. And their model also included extinction rates separate for the two traits. So you might have an extinction rate for self-compatible species and a different extinction rate for self-incompatible species. And their model also had speciation rates. So self-compatible species might form new self-compatible species with a certain rate, and likewise, self-incompatible species might have a different speciation rate. And this balance between the transitions between the traits and the speciation and extinction rates are what Goldberg et al. Set out to study. They had two main findings in their paper, and this is all based on fitting this model that I just described to that phylogenetic data set. Their first finding was that almost all the transitions in their data set were reconstructed to go from self-incompatibility to self-compatibility. And so if you remember, the advantages of self-compatibility are that you pass on more of your genetic material to your offspring, and you can successfully reproduce even when pollen is limiting. And so they see a lot of those transitions. They also found higher rates of speciation and extinction for self-incompatibility, but the net difference between those two is smaller. So if you look at the difference between speciation and extinction, this excess of speciation is much higher in their model for self-compatible species than self-incompatible species. We can see this in this plot. So in this plot, you have a histogram here. This is a probability distribution of rates. These blue and red are for self-incompatible species. So here's the extinction rate for self-incompatible species, the speciation rate for self-incompatible species. This is a statistical estimate of this rate. And then for self-compatible species, these are over here. So what you see is that both speciation and extinction rates are lower for self-incompatible species. But the excess, the difference between speciation and extinction, is much greater for incompatible species than it is for compatible species. And if we just zoom in on that difference over here, you can see that the difference between speciation and extinction for self-compatible species is actually less than 0. That means they go extinct more than they speciate. And over here, the difference between speciation and extinction is positive. That means they speciate more than they go extinct. And so the overall pattern here is that we have this transitions from incompatible to compatible, but then an excess of extinction. So these species tend to transition and then go extinct. Whereas if you can stay over here in self-incompatible, you might have lower overall rates, but a higher excess of speciation than extinction. The conclusion of this paper is that even though evolution tends to lose self-incompatibility, the trait is maintained by giving an advantage to speciation. So it's being maintained by species selection. And if we look within a population, what you would see is this repeated loss of self-incompatibility in favor of self-compatibility. And you'd think, well, how is this trait still in these populations if it's always being lost? The answer is it's staying in these populations through maintaining high speciation rates and species selection. So hopefully that gives you a good illustration of the process of species selection and how we can actually study it in an example.